It is a great pleasure for us to have a very welcome guest today, Catherine Malabou, who in a few minutes will be giving a talk on a topic at the heart of contemporary philosophical and political debate, namely the relationship between anarchy and institution. This talk fits perfectly into the research horizon of the seminar, which this year is dedicated to the theme of the foundation. As some of you already know, the aim of the seminar is to open up a space for discussion and philosophical reflection on politics. More specifically, the main question that our seminar intends to raise concerns the relationship between the global crisis that has hit politics and certain limits of contemporary political thought. Starting from the observation of the crisis of the category of immanence, this collective research has developed over the years through the critical analysis of the concept of institution, understood as the form that the political conflict takes to acquire effectiveness, and the concept of event, considered beyond any messianic perspective, as well as any teleology of history. So in this theoretical framework, the attention that this year's seminar pays to the theme of the foundation is complementary to the investigation of the event that constituted the focus of last year's discussion. The aim is indeed to articulate rupture and permanence, event and foundation. The seminar's activities consist of talks by young researchers, as well as a series of public meetings in which well-known scholars present and discuss their work with us. So this year's series of meetings was organized in collaboration with the chair of political philosophy held by Professor Forti, whose recent research on the concept of anarchic soul in the wake of her mentor, Rainer Schurman, also presents several convergences with the latest book by Catherine Malabou, dedicated to the relationship between anarchism and contemporary philosophy. It is also for this reason that we plan to invite her soon to the Scuola Normale, so that we can discuss with her also in person. So before giving her the floor, I would now like to briefly introduce her research and thus introduce her talk. Catherine Malabou is a professor at Kingston University in London and at the University of California at Irvine, where she holds the chair once held by her mentor, Jacques Derrida. She's one of the leading figures in contemporary philosophical debate, and her works, translated into several languages, have been the subject of numerous studies for years. Recently, interest in his thought has also spread to Italy, as demonstrated by the recent translation of some of his works, namely Ontologia dell'Accidente, 2019, Divenire Forma, 2020, Metamorfosi dell'Intelligenza, 2021, all published by Meltemi, and finally Il piacere rimosso, published this year by Mimesis. So, as these titles partly indicate, her theoretical path has developed along very different research axes, which often go beyond the disciplinary field of philosophy. Her production contains texts dedicated to classic authors of the philosophical tradition, in particular Hegel, Heidegger, Freud, and Kant, as well as to recent developments in biology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence, and of course, essays on feminist philosophy too. However, it is not difficult to observe how her reflection is permeated by a fundamental category, that of plasticity, which not only characterizes her readings of Hegel, Heidegger, and Kant, but also represent the starting point for her analysis of neuroscience and neurobiology, as well as for her recent research on anarchism. In his latest book, published in January this year and entitled Au voleur, Anarchisme et Philosophie, Catherine Malabou analyzes the relationship between the revival and at the same time the removal of anarchism by contemporary philosophers such as Schurman, Levinas, Derrida, Foucault, Agamben, and Rancière. The result of this critical analysis is a thought of the non-governable, in which anarchism emerges as the political translation of plasticity, as the most plastic of political forms. In this regard, one might ask what relationship exists between anarchism and institution, and in particular, whether the only possible relationship is one of simple opposition. Catherine Malabou's talk today is dedicated to this question, and I thank her very much for accepting our invitation. So it is my pleasure to give her the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Matteo, for this brilliant introduction, and thank you to the Scuola for inviting me. I'm very honored to have the opportunity to discuss with distinguished professors and students. And so today I will first present something like a general situation, and then in a second moment I will engage a discussion with Professor Esposito in particular, and yes, and it will become more, let's say, political in the end. So I start. And sorry for speaking in English, but my Italian is really too poor. It has become impossible to talk about institutions without acknowledging the central social, political, and I dare to say ontological role currently played by technology. We are living in a time of generalized Uberization of life, and technological digitalized platforms are institutions of a new kind. In an article called Digital Platforms as Institutions, one can find this definition. I quote, "Platforms are institutions into which digitized routines and rules have been designed based on the digital affordances of the platform. Ride-hailing examples include algorithmic decision making, such as driver-customer matching on price setting." So you see through this definition that platforms are institutions, and the model of this institutionalized platform is Uber, ride-hailing, driver-customer, etc. Uber today appears as the archaic form of such platforms, and which leads me to define the term Uberization. So as we know, the American company Uber was born in the United States, in San Francisco more precisely, in 2009. And thanks to several fundraisers, Uber has been able to develop in various cities around the world. Uber, as a company, gave its name to a more generalized category, that of Uberization. So Uberization has two meanings. First, in its most basic sense, it designates private companies that function as Uber by putting services and individuals in direct contact with each other in a quasi-instantaneous way. So we can think, of course, as we know, as Airbnb, Amazon, Google, etc., etc. They are the most famous examples of Uberization, which is, as you understand, a process, a technological process. And we've been dependent on such Uberization processes while teaching through Zoom, for example. Zoom is another example of this process of Uberization. But there are many others: banking services, healthcare platforms, etc. But more broadly, and this is the second sense, what is called Uberization is a social process, designating precisely the Uberization of society that transgresses the limits of sheer technology and designates the general deregulation of social and economic exchanges. So we see that we move from something which is totally, entirely technological to something that touches on the limits of the social and the political, which of course demonstrates that digital platforms are certainly not mere tools or instruments. They do not only shape new economic organizations, enabling the passage from production economy to an economy based on service. It is true that platform capitalism has definitely replaced the logic of managerial capitalism after the financial crisis of 2008. So at the same time, as I said, they do not only shape new economic organizations, but the effects of flexible and decentralized functionings are not limited to production of collaborative consumption. They also have a fundamental social and political impact. And this is the point I want to develop now. I was looking for a kind of simple, not too philosophical definition of institution. And I found it in a sociologist, the American sociologist W.R. Scott, who has an article called Institutions and Organizations. And he defines institutions as, I quote, cultural, normative, and regulative elements that provide stability and meaning to social life. Institutions are transmitted by various types of careers, including symbolic systems, relational systems, and multiple levels of jurisdiction. So you see, an institution functions as both something legal, including multiple levels of jurisdiction, but also something symbolic, providing new norms, new ways of living, etc. So I chose this definition because it's broad enough. It's not too over-determined. So it allows, in my view, a more general understanding of the term institution. I chose such a broad definition because we are not used to consider digitalized platforms as institutions. And me, I'm the first who, in the beginning, when Matteo invited me to the seminar, thought of institution as something that was referring to the state or to governmental organs. But I was not aware of the fact that, legally speaking, something like Uber is an institution. Platforms are genuine institutions, first, juridically speaking. They have bylaws, they have legal statuses, etc. But also because they have a symbolic dimension, undoubtedly, and they have become socially normative. They have created new habits and behaviors. So in that sense, they perfectly answer the definition I was giving with the help of Scott. And they have become so institutionalized, so to speak, that some theorists, as we will see in a minute, declare that they are in reality more institutional, so to speak, than traditional political ones. Let me develop this point. Platform capitalism, so synonymous with Uberization, you have platform capitalism. So platform capitalism is the most current, recent definition of capitalism. And it is not exactly identical with traditional neoliberal capitalism, but with its extreme trend, that is anarcho-capitalism. And we perhaps can discuss about anarcho-capitalism being just a follow-up of neoliberalism, or if it is something totally different. But anyway, so we are living in this time of anarcho-capitalism. So what is it? Anarcho-capitalism is, first of all, a theory that challenges the role of centralized states in favor of private institutions defending property and self-ownership. And it is clear that Uberization of the social answers this definition: private institutions defending property and self-ownership. And the first theorist to use this term, anarcho-capitalism, is the Austrian school economist Murray Rothbard, considered as a libertarian theorist. So he has a book that is very famous called The Ethics of Liberty. And I will quote from this book. This book was written in the 60s and translated into English in 82, but it was written much earlier. In his view, state and governmental institutions are precisely not institutions. And that's why I was saying a moment ago that perhaps the new Uberizated institutions were perhaps genuine institutions. So I quote from Rothbard: "Governments are not institutions built upon any notion of a social contract, but rather they are formed and are maintained through the continuance of conquest and force. Their most common violation is the confiscation of property through taxation." So it's the main motto of anarcho-capitalists, that the state steals money through taxation. I quote a little bit further: "It would be an instructive exercise for the skeptical reader to try to frame a definition of taxation which does not also include theft. Like the robber, the state demands money at the equivalent of gunpoint. If the taxpayer refuses to pay, his assets are seized by force, and if he should resist such depredation, he would be arrested or shot." So you see, through such a definition, that state cannot be considered an institution because it is based on violence, force, and has, in a certain sense, never been rationally and legally, so to speak, institutionalized. So such arguments may seem surprising, but more recently, in 2009, the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk repeated the same arguments. He published a short essay in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and this engaged a long polemic with Axel Honneth. And the title of his essay was "The Revolution of the Giving Hand," Die Revolution den gebenden Hand. In this essay, Sloterdijk described the welfare state as a kleptocracy because of the tax system. The justification for this system is a supposed balance between the grasping hand, which is the collection of taxes, and the giving hand, according to which taxes are redistributed for social purposes, schools, healthcare, urban welfare, etc. But Sloterdijk says that this balance between taking and giving is not functioning, and I quote, "The grasping hand of government releases its takings mainly for the ostensible public interest, funding Sisyphean tasks in the name of social justice, but in reality, the grasping hand appears to be a stealing hand. Citizens are paying more and more taxes, while it is very clear that the state has given up its social mission." And he ends by asking, "How did we become such docile and conformist, law-abiding subjects?" So you see, it's the same type of reasoning, that the state in reality is hiding its non-legally institutionalized basis or foundation, and it appears in reality, once again, as something very that has not evolved, in fact, from the first epochs of political foundations. It has remained something violent and unjust. My recent decision to approach anarchism from a philosophical point of view, and Matteo quoted the book I just published about philosophy and anarchism. So this decision was not initially motivated by some naive, idealist, revolutionary dream. It was, first of all, motivated by this situation I just described, and what I called in my book the crisis of horizontality. It seems to me that our current epoch is characterized by the coexistence between a de facto anarchism, the one I just described, which is this anarcho-capitalism that is everywhere, in fact. So the coexistence between a de facto anarchism and something that I called an awakening anarchism, that is a political resistance to this anarchism, to this de facto anarchism. So once again, the de facto anarchism, as I just exposed, coincides with the reign of anarcho-capitalism And this train is contemporaneous with the end of the welfare state. In that sense, I think Sloterdijk is perfectly right. The end of the welfare state that has created in all of us a feeling of abandonment, the feeling that the state is not fulfilling its duties anymore, and that we can only count on ourselves. This feeling that we have to be, well, of the necessity to become managers of ourselves in order to survive. That is, to try to find our ways with digital platforms in order to get what we need. In France, recently was invented a platform for medical services. And now it is almost clear that instead of having a contact with social security, we will have to manage our own health through this application. So anarcho-capitalism make us believe that this is freedom. And many people will argue that the use of institutionalized platforms make us more free, in a certain sense, make us freer. Direct transactions, possibility of renting our apartments, of escaping banking systems in some private exchanges, etc., appear for many as emancipating ways of connecting, collaborating, and mobilizing, to the extent that they provide on-demand services for as many needs as possible and with light, flexible structures. So this de facto anarchism is everywhere. One might object, though, that we are, on the contrary, witnessing the global hardening of political interventionism, inseparable from a new form of centralization of economic power. How can you speak of anarchism, one might object, of at a time when wealth is confiscated by a handful of corporations and conglomerates that belong to Uber and Uberization? It is true that apparently we are not at all living in anarchistic times. Because of a reinforcement of political power, political intervention, police violences, etc. Yes, but at the same time, when some political journalists jokingly declare that Donald Trump is an anarchist, they are not playing on words, but trying to circumscribe what the whole world feels as a major crisis, which is the hybrid combination of government violence and centralization on the one hand, and unlimited deregulation of life on the other. So I think that, in fact, this hardening of political control is just a mask for this unlimited deregulation of life. Authoritarianism, as we see in countries like Brazil, for example, and even in a certain sense, the United States, does not contradict the disappearance of the state. On the contrary, I think it is its messenger, the mask of this so-called collaborative economy, which, by bringing professionals and users into direct contact through technological platforms, pulverizes a little bit more any fixity. So it was by discovering the world of crypto monetary transactions and the circulation of non-national currencies that I became aware of this factual evidence. I got fascinated in the problem of the Bitcoin, the problem of the blockchain, that for me appeared as the first signs of this new situation that I tried to describe, bringing together two heterogeneous entities, as I just said, on the one hand, political authoritarianism, and on the other, this kind of unlimited deregulation. As we know, cryptocurrencies, like the Bitcoin, parasite state currencies and compete with the usual monetary circuit of commercial and central banks. So now, what about the second type of anarchism, which is this awakening form. It is obvious that while anarcho-capitalism aims at transparency and visibility, it also authorizes the large-scale but opaque use of data, the dark web, the fabrication of information, and of course, new forms of oppression, exploitation, and subordination. The freedom that it allows is in reality an illusion, and I think we are all aware of that. What I call the awakening anarchism pertains to the emergence of social movements like those of the Yellow Vests in France, or in a very different way, Black Lives Matter in the US, that refuse to be domesticated by any form of institution, like institutions like parties or unions, and they oppose this notion of assembly or assemblies to the traditional institutions, assemblies being self-managed structures of cooperation and mutual aid. So in France, for example, they called the Yellow Vest created assemblies of assemblies, starting with localized assemblies and that generalized in order to aggregate more cities, etc. So clearly, these assemblies are once again opposed to the traditional institutionalized forms of the party or the union. Even if those movements do not always recognize themselves as anarchists, it is clear that they challenge the traditional structures of mass protest by resisting, once again, any form of centralization, hierarchy, or superarching discipline. So in fact, what motivated my book was, once again, this coexistence between the anarcho-capitalism, the de facto anarchism, and this new mode of social protests. That made me conclude to the existence of a polymorphic anarchism, which is as much libertarian and libertaire in French. I don't know what's the translation in English, libertarien et libertaire. The crisis of horizontality pertains to the fact that the two opposed tendency in anarchism, anarcho-capitalism, and in a certain sense, revolutionary anarchism, libertarianisme et libertaire, are today walking on the same ground because they share the same platforms and the same rejection of the state and of, let's say, traditional institutionalized forms of organization. So we have two opposed tendencies on the same ground. That's why I speak of a crisis of horizontality. So now I would like to engage a discussion with political thinkers, and in particular, Professor Esposito. I was very interested in reading his introduction to his book, Institutions. Matteo provided me with an English translation of the introduction. And thank you, Roberto, for having introduced me to Oliver Marshall's book that I didn't know. So I read it before today's talk, Post-Foundational Thoughts, and I found it very interesting. So let me first talk a little bit about this book, and then I will come to you more specifically. So Oliver Marshall affirms that the difference between politics and the political, which is a difference often made by contemporary philosophers, and he quotes Laclau, Badiou, Rancière, and others, you know, this difference, I think Nancy as well, coincides with Heidegger's ontological difference. So in his view, this new difference introduced at the end of the 20th century between politics and the political is an echo or a redoubling or an interpretation of Heidegger's ontological difference. And he declares, I quote, "The political points at society's ontological dimension, the dimension of institution of society, while politics is kept as a term for the ontic practices of conventional politics. So we see that the political aims at the archaic instituting dimension of society, while politics is the ontic designation for existing institutions, conventional institutions. The political difference pertains to the difference between the political, understood as an absent cause, an absent foundation, because the institution of society is constant and cannot rely on a substance or an essence. The institutional dimension of the political is constantly at work because, as being with the capital B in Heidegger, it cannot be a being. So on the one hand, we have this political, ontological movement of constant foundation without any essential basis. And on the other hand, we would have politics understood as the series of institutional effects of such an absence, polity, police, government, etc. This difference, and Marchart is right that it exists, the difference between political and politics exists in many contemporary political thoughts. It is true that this political difference allows philosophers to conclude that society, because of this difference, is not identical to itself, that it is constituted by division, and this is a theme that is so present in Le Fort, the initial division of society, because of this absence of solid ground, so to speak. And this is what allows Marchart to invent this term post-foundationalism in political philosophy. So this difference between politics and the political, or political and politics, helps Marchart to conclude that post-foundationalism is the equivalent of Heidegger's destruction or deconstruction, to the extent that it interrogates the metaphysical figures of ground, totality, universality, essence, and even social classes, as obvious in Laclau, for example. And Marchart concludes, and this is interesting, post-foundationalism does not try to erase completely the figure of the ground, but to underscore the absence of any final ground. So foundationalism is not an anarchist affirmation according to which there's no foundation at all, but there is no final foundation or ground. And Marchart concludes, it is not then a matter of challenging institutions per se, but to accept, to see them as contingent foundations, and he quotes Judith Butler on this point. So we would have to think of institutions as transient, contingent entities that testify for, at the same time, an absence of final basis. As interesting as these hypotheses are, I read the book with great interest. This is a very lively and interesting book. I don't think at the same time that these hypotheses reflect the most recent state of politics. It is extremely striking to see that no post-foundationalist thinker ever felt the need to engage with anarchism, even if conflictually, even though anarchism is the only political set of theories and practices that directly challenge all forms of grounding. This was another motivation for my book. The striking fact that even if it is true, many political thinkers of our time have affirmed that the political was precisely, as I just said, the absence of final grounding. At the same time, none of them, if you take them one by one, Laclau, Badiou, etc., none of them has ever felt the need to engage with anarchism, even if anarchism in its traditional form is precisely a theory that affirms the total absence of final ground. It is not necessary, perhaps, to recall that anarche and anarchia in Greek mean absence of principle, absence of foundation, principle in both its meanings of inception and commandment. So even if some of the most prominent philosophers of the 20th century have developed a strong concept of anarchy, I think of Schumann, Levinas, Foucault, Rancière, Agamben, at the same time, none of them has ever taken political anarchism seriously. For example, if we think of Laclau, he clearly associates post-foundationalist politics with post-Marxism, never with anarchism. So in the end, I want to interrogate this gap between the affirmation of the existence of a post-foundationalism in politics or in political philosophy that opens a new reflection of foundations. And this gap, so between this post-foundationalism and the absence of any serious engagement with anarchism. Because I think that not engaging with anarchism, ignoring it, while reflecting on the collapse of ultimate grounds, is doomed to miss the main political issue today, which is, in my view, to be able to elaborate a new difference, perhaps a new form of ontological difference between anarchism and anarchism, between horizontality and horizontality, libertarianism and the libertaire, libertarianism and decentralized forms of protest. So, in fact, what I think is that we cannot take difference for granted anymore, because we have to build a new form of difference, because the difference in politics between anarcho-capitalism and awakening anarchism has to be done, has to be made, because precisely it appears to us as a crisis. The crisis of difference itself, perhaps. A few studies start emerging on the role of the new technological set of institutions, the role that these new technological institutions play on the traditional ones. But a lot has yet to be done. When this role is analyzed, the role that the new technological institutions play on the traditional ones, this role is unanimously characterized as disrupting. Technological platforms are associated with institutional disruption. Institutional disruption is the term, an expression I found in an article. As you know, a disruption in technology refers to a break or an interruption in the normal course or normal activity of a process. The specificity of technological digitalized platforms is that they function as de-institutionalizing institutions. They challenge traditional institutions by showing that traditional institutions, as I said, are not institutions, and they function as institutions that de-institutionalize the traditional institutions by saying, see, we are more flexible, we're open, etc., etc. So we know, for example, that the use of modern information technologies such as blockchain ensures transparency, reliability, etc. These platforms then appear as non-institutionalized, even if they are institutionalized, even if they are highly normative and mind-framing. So it seems to me that the task today is then not to try to re-institutionalize what anarcho-capitalist operation is currently de-institutionalizing. I don't think that the task is to re-institutionalize what is de-institutionalized, because I think this is impossible. Such an attempt would imply a suspension of the internet, for example. And I think this is totally impossible. It is more, in my view, a matter of bringing to light and resisting the occult domination procedures involved in libertarian deinstitutionalization. I agree with Roberto Esposito that the alternative between constitutive and destitutive power is not a productive one any longer. I don't think, nevertheless, that the idea of a re-elaborated notion of institutive power can respond to the deinstitutionalizing power of anarcho and platform capitalism. Once again, I wonder, I mean, this is a question. I wonder how a re-elaboration of institutive power, yes, can respond to this generalized Uberization of life and politics. In a tentative gesture, but this is really tentative, if we have constitutive, destitutive, re-institutive, I would propose something like substitutive. I would propose substitutive power. This is perhaps what we have to think about. Substitutive power, which would designate a set of processes and protests that aim at capture the deinstitutionalizing force of anarcho-capitalism in order to redirect it in the direction of cooperation and emancipation. It would be to use the power of deinstitutionalization, not to re-institutionalize it, but to bring it, to put it in the service of, let's say, traditional anarchism based on cooperation and emancipation. Substitutive power should work on ways to reappropriate the technology of crypto economy that can create and sustain what the American philosopher Brian Massumi calls emergent collectivity, by creating energy in groups, by learning together, making art together, building a political movement together. So once again, it would be a matter to disrupt the course of anarcho-capitalism by using its own power in the service of awakening anarchism, thus creating decentralized organizations built from a network of public automated contracts. In any case, I think that time has come to try to dig out, in all its potentialities, the substitutive power of awakening anarchism. And I don't think that anarchism, understood as awakening, is anti-institutional. I've read several things in order to prepare for this talk about anarchy and institution. The two notions are not antagonistic. What is antagonistic is, for anarchism, is the centralized institution. This is true. But in fact, when, for example, Kropotkin or Proudhon advocate for the creations of cooperatives or mutual aid systems or assemblies, etc., they define them as, well, as types of institutions. So the problem is not that much to oppose anarchism with institution, but to realize that, in fact, the new task of answering the deinstitutionalization of society is to capture its power in order to found new modes of decentralization. So I would like to conclude by saying that the only attempt at bringing together Lefort's theory of institution, Claude Lefort theories and of institution and anarchy was Miguel Abansur's effort to compare Claude Lefort's notion of savage democracy with Schurman's concept of anarchy. I'm sure you know this article by Abansur called Savage Democracy, in which he tries to compare Lefort with Schurman, and it's very interesting. And he, very briefly, he explains that democracy is savage because it cannot be reduced to an institutionalized formula. It cannot be reduced to a political regime or an ensemble of procedures and rules. So Lefort shows that, Abansur, shows that Lefort's theory of democracy has a kind of anarchistic dimension. And he calls the savage dimension. It is true. But we have to ask ourselves whether this irreducibility of democracy to traditional institutions is not getting secretly, savagely, so to speak, captured by the technical modalities of its expression. Okay, thank you very much. I know it's an abrupt conclusion, I know, but...
No, thank you very much, Catherine, for this very stimulating talk, which I'm sure will raise many questions. So I will say that the discussion can now begin. So if you want to ask a question, you can raise your virtual hand by clicking on reactions and then on the hand icon at the top of the screen, or you can write directly in chat. If you prefer, if you feel more confident, you can also formulate your question in French or in Italian. In that case, please not too quickly. Yes. And I will translate it. I will help you with the translator if something is not clear.
Pardon, j'interviens seulement parce que, j'interviens seulement parce que le pauvre Robert Esposito m'a appelé au téléphone et il m'a dit qu'il y a eu un problème et il a vous écouté presque jusqu'à la fin, mais il a dû aller, donc il s'excuse, il est désolé. Il m'a écrit, il m'a dit que vous écrira ce soir. Et donc, il s'excuse beaucoup. Et merci beaucoup pour votre intervention.
Okay, I see that Simona Forti is not with us anymore. So maybe, I don't know, I could break the ice if there are no questions and ask you a couple of questions, which also gives everyone time to formulate their own. So first of all, yeah, in the contemporary philosophical debate, there is a trend, a tendency to associate anarchism with immanence, with the category of immanence. And yet, the philosophical thought of anarchism that you elaborate seems to me that it distinguishes itself, on the contrary, by a clear rejection of the category of immanence. So maybe can you explain the reason for this rejection? And secondly, I was wondering, listening to your talk, what idea of time and of history could be associated with your philosophical reflection on anarchism? Because my impression is that it is neither a return to Marxist eschatology nor a messianic perspective, but this is only a negative definition. So maybe can you offer us a positive one? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm not, because I didn't follow the seminar, I don't exactly know what you mean by immanence, because I haven't, but I can tell you what it means for me. So I know that, well, immediately I think of two people, two philosophers, Deleuze on the one hand and Agamben. And both, it is true, even in different ways, associate immanence with anarchism. They associate immanence with an anarchism because immanence, and I think of Agamben's reading of, is it Absolute Immanence by Deleuze? No, Agamben's text is Absolute Immanence, and it is a reading of Deleuze's text on pure immanence. You know, when Deleuze analyzes this Dickens figure and defines life as pure immanence. So anarchism is associated with immanence because immanence seems to imply the absence of a distance between action and passion. It is a kind of immanence is a development. It is not something static. It's a development that functions as an unraveling of a relationship between constitution and destitution, action and passion that get never separated from each other. So it is something, this development happens at the horizontal level. And that's why it is associated with anarchism. In my view, there is something, I understand what that means, this absence of distance, because of course, distance is where power introduces itself. Power understood as the distance between one that commands and the other that obeys. And of course, if you reconcile the two action and passion sides, there's no distance for commanding and obeying anymore. But the problem is that in Deleuze in particular, this immanence is still a form of auto-affection. And this is also what you find in Agamben, that in fact, immanence is the suspension of a distance between acting and obeying by virtue of auto-affection. Auto-affecting myself means that I'm at the same time the one that acts and the one that obeys. But in my view, but it would need a lot more explanation, but what I can say is that in my view, as soon as you have auto-affection, you necessarily have the distance between commanding and obeying. Auto-affection cannot be a fusion. And I think that, in fact, in the name of this fusion, the theory of immanence is occulting what in auto-affection, and Derrida has very well demonstrated that, what in auto-affection still remains a scheme of domination. Because to be auto-affected means that you command to yourself. Autonomy is still a self-commandment. So I would need more time to develop this, but I'm not convinced by this term. Now, history, this is also a very complicated question, but to cut it short, I would say that anarchists have always not opposed, but contrasted geography with history. For them, history is necessarily the quest for an origin and a goal. And precisely, anarchism is both a challenge of the origin, which is the beginning, and the goal, which is the telos. And Sherman has demonstrated that brilliantly in his critique of teleocracy. For anarchists, history is necessarily something teleocratic. And geography, on the contrary, is a way of apprehending, of course, something like history, but of apprehending it horizontally, so to speak. Anarchism is contemporaneous with this idea of a spatial history that translates itself into what we would call today ecology. So we could also discuss that, but the most prominent theorists of anarchism were geographers. And I think this is important too. Okay, so I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, you did. So are there any questions?
Thank you so much, and thank you for a couple of reasons. One, because your talk and your book, since I started to read it, is
it should be translated into Italian. There's a small publishing house called Eleuteria.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we can talk about it, Catherine.
Yes.
That could be. So I started to read the book. I read it. I read half of it, and so I'm so it's a great book, and I share a lot of ideas with you. Two questions, one more technical and simple. Would you go as far as Shoshana Zuboff to talk about a sort of new totalitarianism of platforms, or you just stop as, I don't know, as warning us against this kind of neoliberal anarchism? The second question is, for me, deeper, and I was quite surprised not to read in your book about anarchism and philosophy. I share a lot of your critical points towards the thinkers you mentioned, and I was quite surprised not to read the name of Hannah Arendt. Not just because I worked a lot of my time on her work, but because I think she's very, let's say, a certain way to read Arendt is very, very close to what are you looking for. This kind of conjunction again between ontological anarchism and political anarchism. Because the question Arendt poses is, let's say, to think of anarchism, even though she really barely uses this term, but the point is there. And precisely when she speaks as a true example of politics and not of domination and not of rule, the council politics. And so all the kind of cooperation from the bottom of the council systems, of the townships, and so on. So I was quite surprised not to read her name, because remember, Rainer Schurman wrote, of course, under the spell, let's say, of Heidegger, but for him, the way in which Arendt rethought the relationship between philosophy and politics was crucial, pivotal.
Well, thank you so much, Simona. I must confess my ignorance. Yeah, this is a problem in my book. I understand that. May I ask you to send me some references?
Of course.
Because I must say that when I read some books by Hannah Arendt, I was quite disappointed. I found them quite weak. I must confess. The one on when she, I don't remember the title, when she accounts for all the different systems in philosophy. Is it something about the will?
Yes.
Yeah. And I must admit that I never found my entry into her text. Mm-hmm. So I would be very, very, because what you just said about councils, etc., is very interesting, and I hadn't thought. So if you could send me some tips, I would be very grateful.
Yes, no, because there are mainly.
I'm sure you're right, and there's a way of reading her that might be very, very helpful for my own research. So now about your first question. It is difficult because, yes, I would conclude that there's a kind of totalitarianism of platforms. And at the same time, we cannot but use the power of these platforms in order to resist this totalitarianism. That's the problem. This is what I try to explain in my talk. We cannot oppose it because there's no other side. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. I mean, we are all dependent on Uberization. So Of course, we might. I know that some ecologists today are trying to invent modes of life in seclusion where you live in autarky and not use any kind of technological device. But I mean, more seriously, I think that it is impossible to oppose this totalitarianism from outside, because this outside does not exist. So I think that the strategy is to, once again, use the energy, which is, it is true, it has a dimension of emancipation. Who could negate it? For example, me here in the United States, if I hadn't Uber, I would die.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, there's nothing I can do without these platforms. But yes, it would be a matter of, as I tried to explain very clumsily, substitute, capture and substitute for this totalitarianism another possible use of them.
Thank you. No.
Oh, thank you very much, Simona. And please remember that you have to send me.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And also your work. I would be very interested in reading you on Arendt.
Thank you, Kathleen.
No, thank you.
And I hope you will come in Pisa, really.
This is a dream, you know.
Yes, it's so beautiful.
It's so frustrating for me to, you know.
Yes, when you are in Paris, for example, or in Great Britain.
Yes, sure, of course I can. It was just because of the pandemic that everything was impossible.
Yes, I know. Please. You are on the top of our list.
Oh, thank you so much. That's a dream. That's a dream.
Thank you.
So, after this amazing discussion, are there anyone who would like to ask something to Catherine Malabou? Maybe even in Italian or in French. Or yeah. So yeah, I see a hand. Yeah.
There's a hand.
Yeah. So please, Claudia. Hi.
Good morning and thank you. I have a question concerning conspiracy theories in your organization, let's say, or division between anarcho-capitalism and the revolutionary anarchies. How would you describe that?
Yes, thank you very much. This is very interesting. I think conspiracy is a direct consequence of this deinstitutionalizing power of the platforms. Because conspiracy theory is directly a critique of traditional institutions, relying on the idea that the state is lying, that politicians are lying, and it is, in fact, conspiracy theory is an anarcho-capitalist effect. As you know, in the United States, it has been fostered by Trump quite a lot. Like, these global politicians are lying to us, etc., etc. So, in fact, it is a fabrication of post-truth, of non-truth, based on the critique of non-truth. Conspiracy theory is a kind of dialectical system consisting in saying that everybody is lying, and by saying this, fabricating a new lie. So it's an abysmal chain of lies directly induced by anarcho-capitalism. So, but I like your question, because in this crisis of horizontality that I was talking about, unfortunately, the anarchist protests, like this awakening anarchism protests, are sometimes falling into the trap of conspiracy. So this is another sign of the crisis. So this is what I would answer to you. This necessity of building, of fostering a new form of difference. We need a differentiation between the two sides of anarchism. But maybe you wanted to say something yourself about conspiracy?
I was wondering about, for example, the no-vax. In Italy, we call it no-vax. I'm not sure that in English we say the same. Mm-hmm. But also, I'm not so convinced that this conspiracy thing is completely linked to the anarcho-capitalism, because I remember that conspiracy has always been there in a sort of way. If we think about, like, for example, the Zion Protocol, I don't exactly remember the time when it was, but so maybe it's some sort of counterpower, of course, but maybe, of course, it works slightly different than than anarchism as a precise form of counterpower. Mm-hmm. And I posed this question because yesterday night I started reading this book of Erika Lagalis that is called Occult Features of Anarchism.
Oh, and let me write that. Occult.
And she's at the London School of Economics, and from an anthropological point of view and ethnographical as well, she aims to show the common ground between conspiracy theories, occult movements in the history of Europe, for example, and anarchism as well. And this is just the introduction for what I understood from the introduction.
Sorry, could you repeat the name?
Yes, the author is called Erika Lagalis, Lagalisse, and the book that has been translated in Italian as well. In English is called Occult, Occult. I'm not sure about pronunciation. Features of Anarchism.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting. Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't answer to the whole. I'm not able to refer precisely what the book says, but I was interested.
Yeah,
because I just started it. Okay.
Yeah, and I really think that political theory today has to engage with these problems. I mean, yeah. So thank you so much. Yes.
Right. So, are there anyone who would like to ask something? Anyone? Any more question? So, well, if there are no further questions, I think we can conclude the discussion. And I would like to thank Catherine Malabou once again for her intervention today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I would have liked to be with you now and have a glass of wine. Yeah.
We will.
Yes, for real.
We will.
Next time.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we can bring you to the seaside, but you are living on the seaside.
Well, it's quite far, by the way, so I have to take an Uber to go. Okay, thank you so much. And
thank you, Catherine.
And wish you all a very good evening. Bye.
Evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.